Hi, and welcome back to the Shtick, where we're on Zoom. We haven't done this since the lockdowns. So we're actually connecting with a chap in Sydney who I think is a very interesting person to talk about regarding the judicial reforms that is now under scrutiny and a lot of conflagration. And his name is Mark Friedgut. Hello, Mark.
Hey Henry, how are you?
So I took a lot of interest in you personally when you did a Zoom last week with the Australian Jewish Association. They do a frequent, regular Wednesday evening Zoom, and after last week, where I had three segments on the Save Israeli Democracy, I rang David Adler and said, "Look, we need another point of view," and he highly recommended you to give us your point of view and the AJA's point of view in a more clarified way on the shtick.
Well, the reason I got involved in judicial reform is that as a barrister and as somebody who has practiced law in two separate countries, has practiced both as a barrister and as a solicitor in two separate countries, and I actually passed my Israel bar exam in 1987 as well. I became extremely concerned, extremely worried about facile sloganeering, um, the shallow, um, simple assertions, the simplistic assertions that people are making about the judicial reform. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that any resemblance between what the reform actually does on the one hand and what you hear from people who are leading the protest movement, including some people in extremely high positions, on the other hand, is not only purely coincidental, it does not exist at all. And I am willing to show by chapter and verse why that is so. For example, people say that this is a constitutional coup, implying that this is something which is illegitimate, that this is the taking of government power by illegitimate means. It is not. What we have here is an elected majority government that wishes to introduce reasonable judicial reform, which was part of their election platform, something that they went to the electorate with when they were voted into power, and is something that political parties on the right and the left have been talking about since about 1995. Now, I'm sure, Henry, that many of your viewers will be shocked when they hear how completely parif, how completely neutral, how completely um, reasonable the proposed judicial reforms are. Indeed, as Adam Dershowitz correctly said, if every single one of the judicial reforms were to go through without amendment, then Israel would in effect be a country like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United Kingdom, and America. Obviously, every country is different, but in terms of things being anti-democratic, that is utter nonsense. And when people, I've got no doubt that there are people of goodwill who are protesting, but they are being misled by the leaders of the protest movement, people in very high authority, people who have been former prime ministers who are misrepresenting the situation and frankly are lying the people.
So, what is it that's created this divide? I mean, there really is something that's occurred in the last 3 months since the elections that has really stirred the pot and created a massive gap between the extremities. And it's the extremes that are really the worry. Everybody else just wants to get on with their lives.
Well, Henry, I think that what it is probably twofold. First, the very fact that that a right-wing government uh, came into power with a clear majority. This hasn't happened before. As you know, the last four elections in Israel were completely inconclusive, and suddenly you've got a majority government. And I think that people on the left were absolutely shocked by that, were absolutely shocked by the fact that you here had a right-wing government in power. And really what this is a case of, and I again quote Alan Dershowitz, because I agree with him on this point. I don't agree with him on everything he said about this. I vehemently disagree with some of his points, but on this point, I agree with him absolutely. What the protests are about is not judicial reform. The protests are an attempt to undo the last election. And where you get people who are people in very high authority getting up and telling blatant falsehoods and saying it with such conviction repeatedly, people start believing it. It is regretfully an example of the big lie.
Yeah, there is a lot of fake media everywhere these days, and we will discuss this further in the next segment when we'll be coming back to you, Mark, on Zoom. And so we'll be back after the break with more discussion about the reforms and what is really going on and the really bad news that's coming out of Israel. Hi, welcome back to the SHTICK, where we're on Zoom with Mark Friedgut, and we're talking about the reforms that are going on in the Israeli Knesset. Mark, we need to get a little bit more clarity on the actual reforms, and that's what you want to talk about.
Absolutely, Henry, because people are talking about the reforms as if they're some type of fascistic, undemocratic ploy on the part of the right-wing government, and nothing, absolutely nothing can be further from the truth. So they basically, if everything goes ahead, all of the entire package, it consists of, in essence, 7 components. The first component is the only component that has so far been debated in the Knesset, and that is to change the composition of the Judicial Appointment Committee. In every country, in most democratic countries in the world, certainly in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, up until fairly recently in the United Kingdom, in America, it's the president. It is the prime minister alone, usually the constitution says the attorney general, that behind closed doors appoints judges. That happens in Australia, in the state courts, in the federal courts. Israel was out of step with every one of those countries, in that in Israel, the judges sat on the Judicial Appointment Committee and had, in effect, a veto. Because the Bar Association always voted with the judges. So they want to change that. Now, whether one goes with the proposal of Rothman or the proposal of Levine, one says that there should be a judicial selection committee consisting of 9 people. The other says 11 people. These could all change. Whichever way one goes, it is infinitely more transparent and open than in countries like New Zealand or Australia or Canada or the United Kingdom. That is, where the judges will still sit on the Judicial Selection Committee, which they don't do in Australia, but there will be more politicians than there will be judges, and the judges will not have a veto. So that's the first allegedly anti-democratic meme. And if that is anti-democratic, then Australia is anti-democratic, so is New Zealand, so is Canada, so was the United Kingdom, and so is America, where the president basically can choose a judge and it has to simply go for confirmation. But if it's his house that's controlling the Senate, the confirmation goes through. Point 1. The second judicial reform is that they want to, in Israel, unlike any other country in the world, the judges have, in 1995, come out with a decision which said that Israel has a constitution, namely a basic law which was passed by the Knesset in the middle of the night in 1992 with a vote of 31 to 21 or 32 to 21. Most members of Knesset were not even present at that vote. No one knew it was a constitution. It wasn't a constitution. Frankly, it wasn't even reported in the press the next week or the week after that, or the week before. And they said that as a result of that particular law passed in 1992, they can overturn and override any law of the Knesset. So the Knesset is now saying, okay, well, if you consider that a basic law of the Knesset is part of our constitutions, then one law you cannot override, you cannot overturn, is the basic law. Now, there is no country in the entire world where a judge can override the constitution of the country. No country, it doesn't exist. So that is certainly not anti-democratic. The third thing is that the Knesset is saying that unlike countries like Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, a judge of the Supreme Court or High Court is permitted to override or overturn, say a law is invalid, but if they do so, the court has to sit with a full court, that is all of the judges, there are 15 judges, and it has to be a supermajority that determines it. But so what? In Australia, where the constitutional matters, this High Court, in virtually every single case, sits as the full court with every single one of our judges. In America, in the United States Supreme Court, the full court always sits. The Supreme Court only sits as all 9 judges. So why is it undemocratic to say that there has to be a supermajority if you are going to overturn a law? Now, incidentally, in no country in the world can judges overturn and render a law invalid unless it's a constitutional law. But Israel doesn't have a constitution. So the Supreme Court in Israel has said that they've got the right to overturn any law. They didn't believe that they had the right till 1995, and I know of no one who has suggested that between 1948 and 1995, when Israel's judiciary was highly regarded, didn't believe that they had the power to overturn a law, didn't believe that the power of judicial review, that anybody said that Israel was a dictatorship or was a fascistic state or was undemocratic. So that puts paid to that argument. The fourth thing is that the judges in Israel, unlike any country in the entire world, believe that they've got the right to overturn any law made by the Knesset or any administrative action taken, for example, by the cabinet, if they believe that it is unreasonable. Who determines unreasonability? They do, on the basis of their own predilections, their own view. What is reasonable to them, they will overturn it, ignoring what the majority of the people, the government, of the people, for the people, by the people, may have decided. They overturn the rule if they consider in their wisdom that it is unreasonable. And it could be 2 judges to 1, because they consider it as a court of 3, and then overturn a decision of the Knesset voted for by 80 members of Knesset on the grounds that 2 of the judges of the High Court felt it was unreasonable. So the part of the judicial reform is to say that reasonability on its own is no longer a ground to overturn the rule. That is number 4. Number 5, and this is, Henry, this really takes the cake. And people find this so horrifying that even those people who are out in the streets protesting, if they were to hear this, they wouldn't believe it. They would say, I'm talking nonsense. You know who the most powerful person is in Israel at this time? You know, and when I say at this time, I'm basically since the mid-1990s. It's not the prime minister, it's not the president. It is what is referred to as the attorney general or the government legal advisor. How did that happen? The attorney general in most countries, is a politician who's invited to sit in the cabinet. The prime minister can fire him if he doesn't like what he's doing. In Israel, the attorney general is a bureaucrat. The High Court has decided two things. Number one, that the Knesset and the cabinet is bound by the advice. Any advice given by the attorney general is binding on the cabinet and on the Knesset. I mean, can you believe this? This is not an elected person. No, most people in Israel don't even know who it is. But he or she, it's now she, is the most powerful because she can nix, she can veto any law made by the Knesset, any decision, administrative decision taken by the cabinet. So part of the reform is to cut down the power of the attorney general and say the attorney general be like an attorney general in another country. They give legal advice, which the government is free to accept or reject.
So essentially, we wanted to really talk about the lies and misleading information that goes on in the media, despite the your ability to see through the people who are trying to stop this so-called undemocratic laws that are coming through. What's going on? Why this? What is this misinformation?
Unfortunately, this is not simply a case, in my opinion, of fake news by the media. I mean, it is that. Of course it is that, because I've got no doubt that there are many bright people in the media who know what the truth is. The problem here is that you've got many, many people in very, very high authority, former prime ministers, former chiefs of the Mossad, former generals of the army, who really want to overturn a democratically elected election, and they know that this is the way to do it. Because so far I've told you exactly what the reforms are. There is one more which was said to be the most controversial of all, but Netanyahu made it very clear early on in the piece that he wouldn't push it. And frankly, it's not controversial. And that was the override provision. That was that the Knesset, if the Supreme Court determined that a law was invalid, depending whether it was the full High Court unanimously, in which case they could overturn it, not that Knesset, but the next Knesset. If it wasn't all of them, they could overturn it, that Knesset. But the fact of the matter is that in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, if the High Court says that a law means certain things or a law provides certain, it can be overturned by the legislature. The legislature have the power to do that unless it is constitutional, in which case you have to change the constitution. But Israel does not have a constitution. So those are the things. But Henry, what I think, frankly, many of your viewers may be interested in, because people have been shocked when I've told them this. Can I give you some examples of things that the High Court has done in Israel? For example, in 2021 and 2022, the committee that determines who is going to receive the Israel Prize, which is the highest prize that Israel can give, decided to award the Israel Prize to a professor at the Hebrew University who was a vocal spokesperson for the BDS. And the Minister of Education, under whose purview the prize is and who's responsible for it, said, over my dead body, we're not going to give it to somebody who supports an anti-Semitic organization. So they took it to the High Court, and the High Court said, no, that's unreasonable. That's unreasonable. You've got to give it to him. Now, that happened in 2021 and 2022. The High Court and the Attorney General have imposed a gag order on Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, saying that Netanyahu isn't permitted to talk about the judicial reform because he's got a conflict of interest because of the fact that he's under indictment. But that is bizarre for two reasons. Number one, the trial of Netanyahu, the judicial reforms can have literally zero, zilch, nothing to do with the trial of Netanyahu. It cannot affect it in any way because judges are still judges for life, that is, until they retire at the age of 70. And number two, if you're going to talk about a conflict of interest, who's got a bigger conflict of interest? The Attorney General, whose power under these rules will be completely cut down, and the judges who will no longer have complete power to rule the country as their own personal fiefdom. Who's got a greater conflict of interest, Netanyahu or the judges and the Attorney General? And yet they placed a gag order on Netanyahu. They have held that the Minister of Police is not permitted to give instructions to the police as to how they deal with the protests. They said, no, you can only deal with policy. I mean, this is mad. Yeah. And yet it is happening today.
This madness is really at its pitch, and it's made even worse now that since Netanyahu's pressed the pause button, it's somehow or other brought out all the extremist right wing, the really violent people who are nationalists, have come out to fight the left wing.
One thing that I would say is that when you look at the numbers of the protesters against judicial reform, since Netanyahu pressed the pause button, the numbers haven't gone down, they've gone up, which really proves the point, as I said in the last segment that Alan Dershowitz made, that this has got nothing to do with judicial reform. It has got everything to do with trying to overturn the last election.
And that's really your ultimate opinion of what this uprising is about, in a sense.
As evidenced by I mean, Henry, I've given you the reform. Is there any one of the 7 reforms that I've mentioned that are in any way anti-democratic? I mean, one, you don't even have to give me 2, just one that's anti-democratic. And yet you had, I just saw it yesterday, frankly, it made me feel completely ill. A former prime minister speaking in England to Chesham House last week said that, this is a case of Netanyahu seeking to overturn the election, Netanyahu becoming a fascist, Netanyahu becoming a dictator. And of course, he studiously avoided getting into what the details of the reform are. I said, we don't have to get into the... And the reason he studiously avoided is because he probably knows that if he were to go into the details of the reform, people would say, wait a minute, what? Wait, what? Which part of that is a dictatorship? Which part of that is undemocratic? And yet he goes to an audience which has probably the majority of people who are anti-Israel to start off with, and they absolutely trash Israel, and this has been Lapid, it has been Barak, it has been members of the Mossad, and these are people, the former Attorney General, these are people who, like me, are able to go and read the law and see what it actually says. Why are they lying to the Israeli people? Why are they telling untruths in relation to what the reforms are? Say you don't like them. Argue about the reform, like Alan Dershowitz does. But don't say they're undemocratic. Don't say they lead to a fascistic dictatorship.
Well, this is such an interesting topic, and I must say we've gone way over time. And as I said when we started, we could do a 2-hour segment with you easily, and it's beyond my ability to really understand. I think as a constitutional lawyer that you are, you would consider yourself a constitutional lawyer?
Yes, look, I mean, I've handled constitutional cases. I've been to the High Court in constitutional cases. But, the truth of the matter is that when one looks at the 7 issues here, frankly, it's not all that complicated. And when you hear that really all of these things apply in countries like New Zealand and Australia and the United Kingdom, then people should ask themselves the question, wait a minute, are those countries fascistic dictatorships? Why are these people treating Israel differently? Why are they singling it out?
I think that's the real point. I think that in every aspect, Israel is treated differently to other countries. As is evidenced at the United Nations and in so many forums where Israel is derided and bashed, and it's a horrible part of our existence. And I think we have to look at it in terms of Passover, where we were slaves and we were oppressed, and we were liberated by Hashem, our God, who liberated us through Moses. And this happens to be the day before our Passover rituals begin. So we'll have to see it in the context of being oppressed and, being different. We are so different to everybody else.
And Henry, if I could just very quickly comment on that, I couldn't agree with you more. And the thing that really scares me more than anything else is that when you look at it, the 3 occasions that we were basically banished from our land were always when brothers couldn't speak peaceably to brothers. As a result of Joseph's brothers selling Joseph into slavery in Egypt, ultimately all the Jews went into slavery in Egypt. And the first temple and the second temple, they were both destroyed because Jews couldn't get on one with the other. And that's why I am so concerned. Obviously, democracy means people can have their own opinion. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with robust debate. There is something wrong with misrepresenting and providing a false and totally wrong and dishonest narrative.
You are spot on, because that is exactly my point. When we look at this whole situation, where we really need to stop this division, derision, and conflict, and we're trying to find some way of mediating and conciliating our 2 sides of politics. That's
very, very important. Very important. I think nothing can be more important than that. I agree with you.
All right. Well, I'd really like to thank you, Mark, for coming on. We've covered a bit. Unfortunately, we won't be able to show it all. But I'll try and have an extended version to try and make people. We didn't even get to point 6 and 7, but that's okay. We'll go out now with a little bit of a greeting for Pesach, because that's what it's all about. Next week we're having a week off. We're going to be having a week off because of Pesach, and then we'll be coming back with some celebration, because that's the real thing that we do best. Thanks, Mark. And we'll be back the week after next with more shtick, because that's what we do. Hag Sameach, everybody. Hag Pesach Sameach to you too, okay. Mark. And
Hag Sameach.
Everybody in Sydney and all over the world.
Year after year on Passover, we ask 4 questions. But what if this year we were to add a 5th question? As we retell our story of our bondage in Egypt, we're reminded of our persecution, our perseverance, our path to freedom. It reminds us of the countless individuals who are still struggling to be free. With your support, Jewish federations sustain life-saving programs in over 70 countries, building flourishing communities all over the world. But there are countless people who still need our help. Your donations power opportunity, freedom, aid, community. This year, Jewish federations are adding a 5th question to the table. What can we be doing to further repair the world? What would your 5th question be?